Hello, this is a recording for the benefit of the Suffolk Jungian Circle. And as with all of the previous recordings for the Suffolk Jungian Circle, it might be a topic that would interest other people. So if you'd like to comment, even if you're not a member of the group, by all means do. For November, we've chosen to discuss the archetype of the Dark Father, having previously discussed the Dark Mother and all sorts of other archetypes. So this is kind of fleshing out that discussion with a few ideas that people might want to pick up on in the monthly discussion group. So obviously you can't really talk about the Dark Father without also talking about the positive aspect, the Light Father. The dark and light are two sides of the same coin. So the positive image of fatherhood, the positive archetype, at least, and I say at least because this is how we understand it in modern day Western civilization. Whether exactly the same understanding would have been around 500 years ago or in far distant parts of the world, in distant cultures, possibly not. They may have different takes on it. So I'm just thinking of this from the kind of viewpoint that I'm familiar with, but obviously other people may be familiar with culturally, historically different points of view. But the father as an archetype becomes the image of the provider and the protector. Also the boundary keeper, and that goes in hand in glove with the protector role because it is the protection of boundaries that is at play here. So the father archetype, I suppose, a little bit like a bounce on a nightclub door. This sort of strong, forceful figure that protects what is on this side of the boundary, family, particularly vulnerable members of the family, young children. I was going to say the wife, but that's very Victorian and stereotypical. She might not need protecting, but maybe frail, elderly, unwell members of the family and so forth, the ones that are less able to protect themselves, the father stands there as the guardian of that boundary. And of course, historically, when it comes to physical defence, you're fighting somebody off with a weapon or your bare hands or whatever, although there's been plenty of women in the world who are quite capable of picking up a gun or picking up a sword or an axe at different periods of history. But for a sizable portion of European history over the last few centuries, the expectation has been that it is the men who will do that. The sort of warrior woman culture of the ancient, or some parts of the ancient world, has diminished somewhat with the expectation of women being a little bit more like the Victorian stereotype of kind of mild and gentle and not capable of defending themselves or defending their children, and relegating that function to the duty of the father, the husband figure, or by extension uncles and grandfathers and so on, taking on that kind of paternal role of defending and simultaneously putting their own life at risk. So they are the front line. They are the ones that will take the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and take whatever threats, weapons, assaults are being directed at the family. They will fight them off and possibly get injured themselves, possibly get killed themselves in the process of fighting off that hostile force. You could well argue that changing ideas of warfare have sort of worked into this with the notion, fairly recent notion, that civilians ought to be off bounds in periods of warfare, and that it's the combatant role, the soldiers on the front line, which up until fairly recently has only been men. They are the ones who are getting wounded and injured and killed, whereas the civilians ought to be left alone. So they are on that side of the boundary. The hostile force, the enemy soldiers or whatever they are, coming towards the homestead are the threat, and the father stands at the barrier defending that which comes. If you want to put that into Jungian terms, obviously that sort of Jungian approach that you can understand myths and stories and so on, where all of the characters are different aspects of the same person rather than totally separate people, then the paternal force could be seen as standing at the border of the psyche, fighting off threats. Some of those threats could be external, environmental forces, that might be a threat to life and limb and sanity and so forth. that the paternal force fights off. Some of it potentially could be understood as internal, sort of the bubbling forces of the unconscious psyche welling up, threatening to overwhelm the ego or the sense of self, and the paternal quality taking on a defensive role to protect the self, one bit of you from another bit of you, until such time as those two parts can be reconciled by more peaceful means rather than the one overwhelming and tearing down and destroying the other. So that's the more kind of positive role, that defensive, protective, and providing role, as the kind of breadwinner role, bringing home the hunter, bringing home the food from the jungle or the forest or wherever, which is not to overlook the more traditionally perceived feminine role of the gatherer, the hunter, and the gatherer, as the gatherer also providing food, but the kind of different styles of food, different styles of provision. The dark side, coming back to the main focus of this, is then, well, could be understood in two ways if we go a bit Goldilocks, or a bit Aristotle, if you prefer, whether you go too far in that direction of not enough, or too far in that direction of too much. That's when it becomes problematic, it becomes dark. So a lack of going in that direction, a lack of paternal energy would be weakness. Someone who is incapable of defending themselves, incapable of defending any of the individuals in their charge, who just sort of sits there like a wet weekend as threats and dangers and risks overwhelm and attack and destroy, that they fail to fight off these risks. They'd sooner let somebody in their charge suffer and die than put themselves on the front line and risk injury or assault in fighting off these hostile forces. Also, of course, the lack of provision. Someone who's not a good provider, who barely looks after themselves, let alone looks after anybody else. So the failure to provide, and you obviously it's something that crops up more sociologically every now and then, particularly in times of economic downturn and mass redundancies and high unemployment, that whilst unemployment for a woman is obviously very financially and emotionally difficult, the traditional role of the father as provider can then lead to the idea that unemployment hits a lot of men, maybe not all men, but a lot of men harder, in that it's not only a financial problem, struggling to make ends meet, but it's taking away from them a defining feature of their masculinity, particularly if they are fathers rather than childless, in that they may well regard themselves as the main provider. So if they cannot provide anymore because they've been made redundant or just can't get a job in the first place, then that role, that purpose, that function is not being fulfilled, and so they may feel especially useless and pointless and of no great worth or value. Obviously, economics change, and more women in the workplace, and more women earning as much as, some increasingly more in some cases, than men, changes that dynamic, but it doesn't necessarily change hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years worth of cultural programming, shall we say, in which if the man is earning little or nothing because the wife is earning tons of money, or if it's a gay couple, the other partner is earning tons of money, then is that, well, put aside socially acceptable as the opinions of other people being neither here nor there, but is it acceptable internally to the man himself if he thinks, well, I can just sit at home with my feet on the couch and do not a lot because the money is being brought in from elsewhere? I mean, he may be doing lots of housework and childcare and what have you, but he's not necessarily financially earning. Some men, I dare say, would be perfectly happy and okay with that, but others not so much, because they would feel that even if their partner is a high earner, that they themselves ought to be still contributing and earning and providing. So the absence of that becomes a challenge to a sense of role, a sense of function, a sense of valid purpose. In the opposite direction, an excess, too much, is maybe when we think of the Dark Father, it's probably more traditionally in the sense of too much of it rather than not enough of it. So too much guarding of the borders can turn someone into a tyrant who doesn't allow those within their protective circle any freedoms whatsoever, and who regards everyone approaching the borders as a threat. And that does lead to lots of kind of almost stereotypical sitcom style situations with the overbearing father who resents any of the boyfriends his daughters bring home and sees them as a threat to the order of the family, rather than seeing them as potentially nice young lads who might add to the family, rather than threaten and challenge and take away from the family. So that kind of overbearing Victorian patriarchal tyrant who's laying down the law and everything has to be done just so, and terrible fierce punishments for anyone who bucks the system or fails to live up to the rules and regulations put in place for them. So the provision of law, the idea of the father archetype as lawmaker, comes into play here. Initially in the sense of laws within the home, how the household will run and so on. But by extension, if we go for that ancient Greek idea of oikos, the home, being mainly the dominion of women, again quite stereotypical, but then a lot of this is drawing on long-standing stereotypes. And polis, the realm of politics, the realm outside the home, being primarily the domain of men. Then whilst the father as lawmaker has a role in the house, setting rules and regulations for the kids and so on, and back in the day, servants and so forth. Outside the home is perhaps where we more traditionally think of that role of lawmaker in government, in whether local government, small level, or national level of governmental lawmaking, and the idea of the patriarch as setting rules that others must follow. And of course the Abrahamic religions, and to some extent other religions as well, often do have dominant fatherly figures, male figures, who are the ones who turn up with the laws, the divine laws rather than human politically invented laws, that people are expected to follow. And the idea of God the Father, for those religions that have a God the Father figure, often is the idea of him being a setter down of laws, moral rules and precepts that people have to live by, and where perhaps we are tipping into the somewhat dark side, the excessive side, the view that if anyone breaks those laws and commits sins and so forth, they are going to be damned and penalised to a very, very high extent. So it's not just like a clip round the ear, oh, don't do it again. It's more burn in hell for the rest of eternity. Which, I mean, you can argue the theological validity of that point of view, but it's certainly one widely held by a great many ordinary churchgoers, mosque goers, synagogue goers, what have you, that there are severe penalties awaiting anyone who steps outside that quite rigid set of moral precepts of what you should and shouldn't do. So that can take on its own sort of overbearing tyranny, its own kind of suffocating levels of control and rigidity. And there are stories, I should have double checked the name before sitting down to record this, but there is a a story of a patriarch from Rome, ancient Rome, whose sons, grown up adult sons, go and break various laws in a rebellion, and they're captured, and it is the father who is, because of his job as a sort of magistrate, a dispenser of law, who, whereas these days, obviously, if you were a judge or a magistrate and one of your own relatives ended up in the dock, you would have to recuse yourself and somebody else would take over that role. But in this Roman story, the father, as this judge figure, judges his own sons and condemns them to be flogged to death, and then sits and watches whilst the sentence is carried out, which is a horrifically inhuman thing to do, but the argument made, and it was almost seen as kind of admirable thing it was that as a upholder of the law, anyone who had committed the crimes that the two sons had committed would have been sentenced to be flogged to death. So far from indulging his sons and letting them off on a technicality, the judge in this case is saying the law applies to everyone, not just people who are strange to me, but also my own family. We, the family, are not above the law. And obviously we can think of probably a fair few cases of various politicians and what have you who seem to think that they or their relatives are above the law, and we usually lambast them for having that kind of rules for thee but not for me attitude. So, in a sense, a political leader who says, well, the law applies to me and my family as well, and now we will suffer, my sons will suffer the consequences of their actions rather than just be let off with a fine or something petty. Um, there is a point to which he is doing the right thing by not showing favouritism, and also the element of that judicial punishment being carried out. The expectation in law was that if he had sentenced some random stranger to be executed, he, as the judge, would have been expected to sit and watch it rather than go down the pub for a swift half and look the other way. And so he's effectively saying, well, just because they're my sons doesn't mean I should not do the job which is expected of me to carry out in regards to strangers. The kind of mentality that could sit and watch your own children being brutally executed, not even a quick death, but a slow, horrible, painful death. I can't imagine the state of mind you would have to be in to do that, or what it would be like to wake up the next day knowing that you had done it. I can imagine if I ever went through anything like that, I'd be jumping off the nearest bridge. I don't think I'd cope with it. But the representation in Roman myth is that he was this super strong figure who just didn't buckle to this emotional weakness. It was a very, very stoic figure. And that stoicism is one of the positive features of the light father, the positive archetype of the father, but also arguably remains in the dark father, but kind of cranked up half a dozen notches. So the unyielding lack of emotionalism that makes a judgment and isn't swayed by tears and weeping and suffering, and it just, nope, this is what's going to happen, boom, and I don't care if you suffer in the process, tough luck. The law will be carried out, the judgment will be carried out, no matter the consequences, no matter the human distress for anyone. And there are various other stories from other mythologies of that kind of a situation arising, where someone is seen to be unyielding to kind of a sympathy, unyielding to, well, what by the judgments of the day might have been classed as human weakness. I don't think I'd class it as weakness, I'd see it as just common humanity, but for some points of view it would be deemed as a form of weakness. So that kind of, is it a positive, is it a negative? Well, maybe this is a kind of an Overton window situation where something that would have been classed as a positive maybe 1,000 years ago is less and less seen as positive these days. Well, certainly not in modern Britain, maybe in other parts of the world, but not in modern Britain. I don't imagine it would be seen as a very positive thing by many people today. So maybe what was positive has now become negative, has now become kind of part of the dark archetype. And Jung does allow a lot of cultural elements in the definition of the shadow of the darkness, that there is not a kind of hard and fast list of precise things, precise bullet points that are always and every way classed as being in the shadow. It's more subjective, and it is whatever your culture, whatever your family upbringing classes as in the shadow, that's what gets put there. So something that in one culture might be considered really good, in another culture might be considered really bad, and whether it's light or dark depends when you are, where you are, so forth. So there is a sort of flexibility to how we understand these ideas, so that moving window of definition is one that sustains. one that remains. An angle he talks about in one of his books, using the Latin term octa rerum, as a driving force, a vital force. Without getting too graphic in the sort of differing images of the mother archetype and the father archetype, and the extent to which basic human biology overlaps onto those archetypes, the father provides the raw oomph, the raw force. The mother shapes it into form, into flesh. Similar ideas with the left hand and the right hand pillar at the top sephira in the Kabbalah, the Tree of Life. One is the raw force of the father, the other is the form shaping quality of the mother, the womb, that takes that splurge of energy and makes it into something definite and concrete and solid within the material world, and therefore susceptible to the sufferings of the material world. So in creating the joy of physical life, you also create the potential for the misery of physical life. There's the two sides of the coin. So it's that raw oomph, that octoreum, that driving energy that pushes forward, boom, out into the world, which in more day-to-day psychological terms is the opposite of inertia. It is kinetic motivating energy. So someone without it would be just a bone idle blob who never got out of bed, never got off the sofa, never left the armchair. They just sit there and sit there and sit there and sit there and do nothing, ever. It needs a motivating force to come along and internally kick you up the bum and say, right, got to get out of bed, got to go and do this, got to go and do that, be here, be there, be the other. So it gets you moving, it gets you doing, it gets you experiencing. So it is the force that pushes towards experience, and contrasting the maternal-paternal energies again. The motherly energy, which, as we've said in previous podcasts around this, these are archetypal qualities, not necessarily limited to human sex. So a woman could express either maternal or paternal energies. A man could express either paternal or maternal energies. So this is not linking only to what women do, only to what men do. So the maternal energy embraces and nurtures and looks after the vulnerable. And when it starts to tip over into sort of less and less healthy behaviours, wants to keep the children vulnerable for as long as possible, and not cut them at the apron strings, keep them young and vulnerable and childlike, as long as humanly possible, to not let them go, to not lose the role of mother. Whereas the archetypal father force is like the birds in the nest, the parent bird who comes along and kicks the fledgling out of the nest and says, fly! Don't just sit there, go on, fly, do it. So the paternal energy is moving the child little by little by little towards the point where they will achieve independence and leave home, rather than just slum it in mum and dad's house for the rest of their life, getting their washing and ironing and done, their cooking done for them, and they never grow up and they're just this perpetual teenager even into their 40s and 50s. It's the force that says, no, none of that, get off your backside, get out there, get a job, go and study for a qualification, go on, go and do something. And if the youngster in question goes, don't want to, and has a Kevin moment, it is the force that metaphorically gives them a smack round the ear hole and says, get off your backside and do it or else. Brings in the consequences, brings in the rules and regulations that says if you do not conform to these standards, then there will be an unpleasant consequence. Whether it's a smack round the ear hole or a kick up the bum or whatever it may be, there will be something that happens that motivates you to go on. And again, coming back to this idea of these as internalised forces within the same person, you could say this octorerum is the part of us that motivates the rest of us to get going in the morning and do stuff and push into new grounds, new experiences, not just live in a rut forevermore doing the same old, but pushes us forward into something new, something which may be a bit scary, maybe a bit difficult, maybe a bit intimidating, but it's the energy that says, no, get up, Go, do, try, fail maybe, but try, give it a go. And pushes the other parts of us. And if the other parts of us resist and have that truculent, inert teenage thing going on, then there will be consequences. And the consequences are not so much that some bloke turns up at the front door and gives you a smack round the ear, rather they are that an internal force within you will create chaos. And the chaos is the penalty for not listening to it in the first place. So not responding to that drive that is trying to push you into new experience, but just sitting and being inert, being a lump. So it's a motivating force to push on. In a dark sense, it could be so motivating, it becomes bullying, it becomes unrelenting. It doesn't allow people a breathing space, it doesn't allow them to have a bad day, it doesn't allow them to need to take time to lick their wounds after failure before they go back to try again. It's constant. You fell off the bike, get back on the bike, get back on it. There's not even time to put a plaster on the bleeding wounds and scabs where you fell off the bike and grazed yourself. It's becomes inhumanly pushy, to the point of cruelty, not allowing for the sort of what should we say, motherly warmth to put a plaster on your scabs and give you a chance to pull yourself together before you try again. It's now. So an excess of pushiness is like a really overbearing sports coach who doesn't even allow you time to draw breath before you have to get back out there and do it again and do it again and do it again. So that becomes problematic, it becomes difficult, it becomes unhealthily challenging in all sorts of awkward and difficult ways. So that's one way of understanding that element. Gareth Hill picks up on the notion of what he calls dynamic and static masculinity, which is both masculine in actual men, but also potentially masculine energies in women, the animates, in terms of the animus carrying forth as a quality in them. The dynamic he associates with traits like cleaving and penetrating, who are cleaving, separating one thing from another, separating things into categories, penetrating, thrusting forward into new territories, new areas, new ground, breaking new ground. And so it's that kind of fatherly quality as the pushy bit, the octorerum, shoving you onwards, do new things. And the cleaving element is the more kind of intellectual, analytical, putting things in boxes, understanding them, classifying them. This goes with that, but that goes over there, and everything is organised and structured and labelled and so on. The static masculine is more the law-giving quality, the one that wants to sustain tradition, law-giving and the guardianship, the sort of protecting the boundaries element, where nothing hostile is allowed to come in and mess up the happy, stable home. So it's structure, organisation, stability, the continuity of law and things being unchanging and sustained, which again could tip over into excessiveness, too much law, too much control, paranoia about anything new coming in from the outside, and like an overexcitable guard dog barking at it and scaring everything off, rather than allowing for the possibility of new presences coming into life, new change, new opportunities. So too much is a bad thing. So back to that kind of Aristotelian Goldilocks bit of too hot, too cold, just right. Too much or too little of a force is a threat, but in two different ways. Getting it just right is the challenge. Jacobi, another therapist, he makes various arguments around problems in family dynamics arising from fathers who are either absent or neglectful or very, very weak and not particularly fatherly, excuse me, leading to problems for the child. And as far as Jacobi is concerned, one of the problems for the child as they grow up is that they tend to overly idealise the father as an image, having had not sufficient real life experiences earlier on in their life, and it becomes abstracted, it becomes spiritualized, and Jacobi sees that as having a role in a lot of religions. That it becomes this abstractly spiritual energy rather than a more kind of grounded day-to-day energy of fatherly presence. There are a variety of archetypes in myth, literature, film, so on that we could look at as both light and dark fatherly figures. A very obvious one is Darth Vader in Star Wars, the Dark Father, the menacing figure. And of course, we don't find out is a father or is Luke's father rather, and Leia's father until very near the end of one of the films. Luke, I am your father. Up until that point in time, he's just been this hostile tyrant, this enemy force, which, as the kind of the heavy in the Empire, he is the one that comes along and crushes worlds and imposes the rule of law. It's that father as excess stability, as excess law giving, that Darth Vader particularly takes on board. The punitive father comes along and chops Luke's hand off and crushes entire civilizations for rebelling and daring to stand up against the tyrannical rule. You could kind of link that in a little bit with Durkheim and excuse me, his ideas that deviance, rebellion, is almost like a kind of a necessary evil, in that a society, he talks about the society of angels, in a world where everyone was absolutely totally obedient to the law, never did anything different or strange or new or weird, there'd be no innovation, there'd be nothing but stagnation and boredom and inertia. You need an element of strange, weird, rebellious people who push the barriers and push and push and push. Sometimes they push in idiotic ways that achieve nothing, but every now and then you get one who pushes in a direction that is actually beneficial to society, and they bring about a positive innovation, a positive change. And so there has to be a balance between the people pushing the envelope and the forces of law and order saying, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that, and imposing the laws to allow a chance to keep a lid on the destructive, idiotic envelope pushing, but also at the same time to allow the genuinely innovative and creative envelope pushing that would bring about a positive change if it is allowed to do so. So there has to be a kind of a balance between the two there, and you could see that in a sort of human way with real world fathers as their kids get older and they push against bedtimes and rules and regulations, that some of that pushing has to be allowed because it will eventually enable the child to grow up. Maybe the father is not recognising how rapidly the child is maturing, and so stepping back and saying, well, actually, all right, maybe you're old enough for us to relax that rule, and you can stay out a bit later, you can stay up a little bit later before you go to bed, you can do this, you can do that. Things they weren't allowed to do beforehand. The rules have got to be allowed to change. Otherwise, you'd be perpetually treating 15-year-olds as if they were 5-year-olds, which wouldn't be a healthy thing to do. So it's a recognition of the necessity of change. The positive father archetype allows that, recognises that, has the ability to integrate it, whereas the dark, restrictive father doesn't have the ability to recognise that. And so the rebel becomes a threat, but a threat from within, bubbling up as a rebel within the family, rather than as a threatening force coming across the borders from outside, as a sort of an enemy threat, that word, to be fought off and defended against. But I'm conscious of time and I've got to go and do other bits and pieces, so we'll end this one here. Hopefully it's provided a few ideas that will kick off more discussion when the group meets, and if you're not in the group but would like the link on Teams to take part in the discussions, just send me a message. And I will send you a link for it's the last Wednesday evening of the month. So I'll send you a link for that if you would like it. Thank you. Bye bye.